Well, I suppose the first thing you would have to say is that I was educated in the analytic tradition in Australia, which the department was strongly in that direction. I did then consider other approaches later on. I mean, there were people, even when I then went to Oxford, and of course that was also strongly analytical, but there were people who were trying to promote a more continental view. Alan Montefiore, for example, was one of those. So I looked at some of the existentialists in particular at the time, but it didn't seem to me to be satisfactory. I mean, I guess I wanted some answers, and what I was reading was things that sounded rhetorically rather deep, but didn't really help you at all in trying to answer these questions. So, you know, really the existentialist idea at the time, Sartre was the sort of leading exponent, and he had this famous example of the person who might join the French resistance or look after his mother. And he was basically saying, well, whatever you choose, you know, as long as you choose authentically, this is right. I think I was already perhaps more utilitarian in my thinking, and my response was, well, it's going to depend on the circumstances, whether, you know, how much you can do for the French resistance. Maybe that will be much more important than looking after your mother. And you know, I thought there's more to be said on this than the existentialists were prepared to say. One thing about the analytic tradition that I was always educated in is the importance of clarity. The idea was that if you are clear in what you're saying, then even if you're wrong, people will be able to see what's wrong with what you're saying, and the debate will advance because people will then see what doesn't work, and they will put something that does work. And that, I think, is very helpful in applied ethics, that if you state positions clearly, then other people can argue against those positions, and you can see whether the arguments work or don't work. Whereas the continental tradition, to my way of thinking, doesn't put that kind of value on clarity. It rather puts a value on, I suppose, what is supposed to be profundity, but I think sometimes this is more a matter of things sounding as if they're really deep, because they're somewhat obscure and you don't really quite know what is being said. So whereas with an analytic approach to applied ethics, you can get a clear sense of what's being said, or you can ask the right questions that will lead to a clearer understanding. With the continental tradition, if you ask a question, you sometimes just get more obscurity, not more clarity. And I think in applied ethics, we are trying to communicate often with other people who are part of the real world. For example, in bioethics, we may be communicating with physicians who are treating patients. In environmental ethics, we may be communicating with policymakers of various kinds. In talking about the treatment of animals, we may be trying to communicate with scientists who use animals in research, and so on. So I think they appreciate the idea that they can understand what we're trying to say and they can respond to it, consider objections and so on. And I think that that's why applied ethics broadly in the analytic tradition has actually been very successful in connecting up with people outside philosophy, whereas in the continental tradition, I don't really think that's the case at all. Well, I think it's clear that if you compare these traditions, applied ethics in the analytic tradition has had a major influence on the way people act. It's led to large numbers of people ceasing to eat animals. It's led to people setting up organizations to fight for better treatment of animals and so on. If you look at the continental tradition, I mean, the philosophers and thinkers write about animals, but what flows from it. Mostly, they don't themselves even become vegetarians. I mean, Derrida writes this famous essay where he thinks about, his cat contemplating him naked and something like that. But what's the conclusion that follows? You could read certain passages of this and you could say, oh, this is a man who has a good empathy with animals. This is a man who can put himself in the perspective of the animal, and seems like it would follow from this that many of the ways we treat animals are wrong. But, he doesn't come out at the end and then say, because of this, it's terrible to lock animals up in factory farms and we should all boycott this, we have to try and change this system, which is what the analytic philosopher probably would have done. So that's what I mean, that in the end, the writing about animals in the continental tradition doesn't really challenge the status quo, hasn't led to any developments making a difference. And by contrast, the analytic tradition, which people in continental philosophy sometimes think of as somehow more conservatively oriented, but it's actually been very radical in the impact that it's had. Capitalism is a very pervasive global system and it affects everything in some way or another. So it's not a remarkable insight that philanthropy existing in a capitalist world is affected by capitalism. What I would really like Zizek to tell us about is what he thinks the solution is. And that's what I don't find. I don't find either a alternative to capitalism, and we know that various alternatives to capitalism have been sketched by philosophers before, but you would have to say they've not been remarkably successful. I think here in Romania you don't need to be told that. We need to have a better alternative offered, and we also need to have a path sketched out whereby we can get from here to this better alternative. Now, if Zizek would really seriously think about that and suggest that, I would be interested in looking at it and seeing whether I think it's better to put our energies into that than into philanthropy. But in the absence of something like that, I would say philanthropy is the best that we have. We're not in a perfect world, but we don't know how to get to a perfect world. So philanthropy will help, can help large numbers of human beings to live better, more dignified lives, better resources, not to watch their children die of preventable diseases and so on. So I think it's not a good argument against philanthropy to say that it's tainted by capitalism. We should work at making it as good as we possibly can within the boundaries of things that realistically we're not going to be able to change, at least in the near future. Well, I think it's remarkable that applied ethics has done as much as it has, and that's because at the time that I was studying philosophy as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, there wasn't really that expectation. In fact, the dominant view probably still was that philosophy is morally neutral. I wrote about this, one of my first little pieces, a piece called Moral Experts that was published in Analysis, has two quotes, one from C.D. Broad and one from A.J. Ayer, and they're both essentially saying that it's not the business of the moral philosopher to tell anybody what to do. One of them uses the word preaching, as if a moral philosopher who starts to make suggestions about how we ought to live is becoming a preacher, a religious teacher or something like that. And so, it was just at a time when people were starting to move away from that. But the whole idea of applied ethics was very new, although really, of course, it was old, but at least it hadn't been done for maybe 50 years or something before the time that when I was just a graduate student. So there weren't any expectations really much as to whether this would succeed in influencing people or not. And against that perspective, I think applied ethics has done extremely well. Of course, I would like more people to be aware of it. I would like more people to read it and think of it, but I think that is starting to happen even outside the universities, and to that extent I am somewhat optimistic. I mean, we have now magazines published for non-academic people who are interested in philosophy, and they discuss philosophical issues. We have some radio and TV programs in various countries that present philosophical discussions to general readers. I think there's a real interest out there in the community, and I can see a positive future for applied ethics from that perspective. I think the difference between my situation and that of Socrates is that I'm in an age in which there is a very widespread and diverse media, and generally speaking there is freedom of expression, at least in the countries in which I find myself. So it's not possible to prevent me speaking, and my ideas find a lot of support as well as a lot of criticism. I'm not troubled by the fact that people disagree with me. I think that's, it's good. Philosophy thrives on ongoing debate. The only frustrations I have is when people don't really bother to try to understand what I'm saying and just seize on short quotations and then use them to attack me or to attack institutions where I'm speaking or something like that, as in the case here in Romania. I find that immensely frustrating because it just seems as if very ignorant kind of views are having a significant influence in society. I think I was attracted to the concreteness of utilitarianism. That is, that I could see what it was talking about. Everybody knows what suffering is, everybody knows what happiness is. Whereas it's not so clear when people make claims about the rights that human beings have. It's not so clear what that means or where these rights come from. So I thought that, well, there's something positive about utilitarianism, and then of course there are all these well-known objections to utilitarianism. And the first course in ethics that I ever took as an undergraduate at the University of Melbourne was taught by a philosopher called H.J. McCloskey, who was very opposed to utilitarianism. But because I thought there's something in it, I looked hard at the objections that he was presenting, and I felt that they were not as conclusive as he thought they were. I felt that there were answers that the utilitarian could make to these objections. So on the one hand, a pretty clear and concrete theory. On the other hand, objections that are not really convincing, and alternatives that themselves seem to me to be open to serious objection as to what the basis was of the values or rights or duties that they were claiming existed. So it seemed to me in the end that the utilitarians had the better of these arguments, and that's the way it's continued to seem to me. Yeah, I suppose so. But I think in a way it is something about my way of thinking that is suspicious of things that are more rhetorical than they are enlightening. And as we were talking earlier about continental philosophy, and I said something similar there, I don't really respond well to things that may sound very deep, but really when you then start to ask some further questions about what exactly does this mean and why should we believe this, they were not good answers. And I think that's true of a lot of deontological views that, you know, say if we talk about the principle of respect for persons, which was a principle that my teacher H.J. McCloskey thought was very important. I wasn't quite clear what that actually amounted to, you know, what it was, given that you were always going to have to make choices that ended up advancing the interest of some people at the cost of the interest of others. What it was to show respect to them was not really clear to me, whereas what it was to cause them to suffer was something that is very clear. To me, I mean, we can distinguish between consequentialism and utilitarianism. So consequentialism is the view that the right action is the one that has the best consequences. I don't really see any serious drawbacks to that. Then the utilitarian fills in this framework of consequentialism with a particular theory of value, which for many years the theory of value that I held was preference satisfaction, preference utilitarianism. In the point of view of the universe, which I published last year with Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek, we consider preferences, but we actually lean more towards more traditional hedonism, to Sidgwick's idea that value consists in positive conscious states. I still think that this is a difficult issue. So you could say a weakness of utilitarianism is defending the particular theory of value. What is that? And is there only one value, as the classical utilitarians wanted to say? Or should we be pluralistic about values, as many consequentialists will say? Now, on the one hand, I think that the pluralists about value have this problem of saying, how do you trade off the different values against each other? You know, how do you, if they say, for example, I don't know, autonomy is an independent value, so how do we weigh up autonomy against happiness or something of that sort? So that's a difficulty for that approach. And the alternative is to say, well, no, I'm going to be a monist, there's only one value, so let's say you're a hedonist. Even then, it's not absolutely clear that you only have one value, because you have the value of reducing suffering and the value of increasing happiness. And utilitarians have generally thought of them as just different points on the same scale, but it's not really clear that they are. There's some work being done recently that suggests that they're different, both in the way that they can be seen in the brain and the way they operate in the brain, and also that in terms of the comparisons, how much suffering is to be compared with how much pleasure, how do we judge that? And again, it's not obvious that there's a single scale for comparison. So I think a lot of the difficulties of utilitarianism that I see as the tough questions are about the theory of value that you fill it in with. I think a lot of our intuitions we ought to be suspicious about, partly because of their origins, which, you know, they might be relics of religious traditions that we no longer hold. They might be relics of an evolutionary past when we developed intuitions that were well suited for living in a community of 150 people whom we saw all the time but didn't interact with others. But now I think, you know, we clearly live in a different world, and those intuitions are not good guides to how we ought to act. I try to draw a distinction between what I would see as rational intuitions or appreciations of normative truths that are rather more abstract and more rationally based, more based in cognitive abilities, as compared with intuitions that are more visceral. I think that we can't do without some sort of intuitions at the base of our views, in terms of the foundations of our views. But I would hope that it could be shown that those are the ones that are more rationally based, rather than the ones that have some sort of like evolved gut response to something. Yeah, I think they can. They're both cases of saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 life, which looks to me like utilitarian thinking. I think effective altruism presupposes the idea that it's good to make the world a better place. So it presupposes an element of altruism at least. But the emphasis on effectiveness, I think, comes from the growing body of studies about what really works and what doesn't work. And people have reacted against more traditional idea of philanthropy, which tends to be more emotionally driven, that people respond to some charity because it appeals to them, but they don't do any research on what the charity will actually do with their money, how much good it will do. And there was a lot of criticism of aid being wasted in this way, and therefore people started studying what does work and what doesn't, and now there's quite a body of evidence, particularly in the field of global poverty, which is where most of this discussion takes place. So that people can now really discuss the effectiveness of giving to one charity rather than another, or at least they can discuss what kind of evidence there is that one charity is more effective than others. And that, I think, creates a whole new confidence in the value of philanthropy, because people can now be more aware of what they're actually getting for their money. Because it enables us to see more clearly what we are getting for our money, it sets out the choices better, and it then leads to discussions about which outcomes are better than others, and that's a philosophical discussion because it's very much value driven. So that's one aspect of what it does. It also forces us to look at our concepts of expected value, expected utility, and try to say, because the charities that get recommended by these more rigorous charity evaluators like GiveWell tend to be a fairly limited subset of charities that are easier to evaluate rigorously, and it excludes more speculative kinds of charities that are going to advocate on behalf of the poor. So I think it also leads to a discussion about what expected utility really implies in situations where we are comparing one option that has a high probability of a moderately good outcome against another that has a very low probability of an extremely good outcome. The example that I use of a case that I think is easy to decide is donating for very expensive additions to museums or art galleries as compared with donating to help people in extreme poverty in some way or other. And I think you can show that this is, it is objectively better to help people in extreme poverty, because you can ask people to use the economist methods of willingness to take certain risks of bad outcomes. You can ask people whether they would be prepared to go and look at the art in the new wing of the gallery, even if there was a risk of a bad outcome like going blind, and even if that risk was only, say, 1 in 1,000. And I think most people would say they would not run a 1 in 1,000 risk of going blind in order to see a new wing of an art gallery. So I think that enables you to get a grip on what is the value of renovating the art gallery or building the new wing as compared with what is the value of preventing somebody from going blind. And I think those sums clearly come out in favour of helping people in extreme poverty. At the other end of the scale, one that I don't know how to answer is if somebody says, and this is now hypothetical, but if somebody says, so suppose for the same amount of money, I could save a child from dying of malaria or diarrhea or something like that, or I could get 100 hens out of a battery cage. Which is better? Now I think that hens have miserable lives in battery cages, and I think they're basically suffering the whole time they're there. So getting 100 hens out of a battery cage is, to me, a significantly good thing to do. How do we compare that with the death of one child and the grief of the parents and so on? It's very hard to get those levels of comparison. And somebody might say, oh well, that's easy. Or a child is easily worth more than 100 hens. Okay, so what if it's 10,000 hens or 100,000 hens or 1,000,000 hens? I think at some point, unless you're just an out-and-out speciesist biased towards humans, at some point you would have to say the suffering of that number of hens is worse than the death of one child. But I don't know where that point comes, and it's very hard to get any handle on it. So that's the kind of question I think is very difficult.